Maria Tumarkin is a writer, a cultural historian, and a teacher of creative writing, whose 4 books to date, Traumascapes, Courage, Otherland and Axiomatic, have poked and provoked and challenged and confronted and basically changed the landscape of Australian non-fiction. Her awards include the Melbourne Prize for Best Writing and the International Windham-Campbell Literature Prize. Axiomatic was named one of the New Yorker's top 10 books of 2019. Thank you so much, Maria, for joining me.
My absolute pleasure, Nick. Thank you.
Let's start with the part that poetry has played in your life, in your literary development, both as a reader and as a writer, its importance and yeah.
Well, I was born in the former Soviet Union, and so I was born into Russian as my mother tongue, and my the kind of my deepest love from that period of my life prior to migration was poetry, Russian language poetry. I also wrote poetry of questionable quality, but that's okay. We're all allowed to do that, I think. And I attended a literary club at the Palace of Pioneers in the hometown of Kharkiv, where I was born in Ukraine, from the age of 7. And come to think of it, I mean, it's a literary club, but we only talked about poetry, as if we just assumed that when we talk about literature, at the very top of that mountain, there's poetry. So we hardly ever spoke about other kind of forms and genres. So yeah, and I think reading poetry, writing poetry, listening to my peers read their poems for the first time, copying poetry, banned poetry from Brodsky, Pasternak, and others, using the carbon paper for the multiple copies to be produced. All of that is such an integral part of me sort of coming through my sort of early adolescence and deeper into the adolescence and kind of figuring out that literature will stay at the center of my life in one way or another.
And I'm one, poetry to me seems to be, as someone who is ignorant in other languages and only really speaks the one language, poetry seems to me to the hardest one to read, not in its natural language. Can you? How do you go?
Yeah, I think it's true for me. Like I will shy away from declarations, although you've seen me not shy away from declarations in the past. But this time I'll be a little bit more circumspect. But I would say that it's true for me, and I think that whatever happens for me when I read poetry in Russian doesn't happen to me when I read it in English, even after 30 years of living in Australia in the English-speaking context, and writing in English and also beginning to dream in English as well. So English has truly colonized me in so many ways, but I do not get the same, like it doesn't land in my body in the same way. I don't get transported in the same way. There are all these barriers that are to do with just not quite being able to connect. Yep.
Did you ever want to be anything? Did you ever want to do anything other than write?
Yeah, absolutely. Like in terms of my not guilty, but like totally fantastical kind of, thing, that was stand-up comedy. But like I always knew like it was not going to happen. But that was always, not always there, but for a chunk of time that was there. And certainly like there is a book by an American nonfiction writer, Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, who wrote a kind of previous big book of nonfiction that would have been almost 20 years ago called The Random Family, which was a really quite a sort of paradigmatic text, when it came out. Like it was a big deal. She spent like 13 years observing a network of families in Bronx, and anyway, so a big book now can be questioned. She's a white writer writing about African American communities, but nonetheless a hugely influential text. She's been writing a book about stand-up comedians for the last 10 years, and she's been following them around in the same sort of way that she does all of her work. It's super immersive, and she just gives it all the time in the world. And there is probably no other book that I'm waiting for as much as I'm waiting for this one. It's like the combination of a practitioner of nonfiction who does things in a way that is kind of is a maximalist when it comes to nonfiction. She will go to the ends of the earth to do the kind of work she wants to do. That deeply appeals to me. And then the subject matter, and it's like the nexus of these two things. And it's like, there's no other book that I want to read as much as this one. So in terms of kind of other things that I wanted to be, when I came to Australia, I did not think that I could be a writer. And you've heard me talk about it. I'm not going to bore you, but like I didn't think that I could be a writer in English. So when I went to Melbourne Uni and ended up doing a PhD in history, I did sort of imagine myself doing historical work. I never wanted to be an academic. But I did imagine some kind of research and the kind of, the imperative always historicize, that for every kind of conversation, urgent, important conversation, every conversation that needs to be had cannot be had without knowing the history, right, of all the kind of key things that are happening in that conversation. That really was very, very compelling. So I thought maybe some version of that could be my life. But there were other things, I wanted to, build orphanages, and kind of, that kind of stuff. But yeah, so it's not, I guess it's important to say that I'm not one of those people who always knew, was never in doubt, just sat in the pool of my own certainty about myself. Like, no, that's not the case for me.
I'm really interested in what you said also. I'm just going back to what you said about stand-up comedy, because just following on from poetry, it suddenly seemed to me that the similarities between poetry and stand-up comedy in terms of needing to understand the culture it comes from is very similar. It's trying to understand stand-up comedy from other cultures is extraordinary. Like you must miss so much similar to poetry.
Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't even claim to understand Russian comedy, for instance. Well, you would obviously get Soviet comedy. You'd obviously get a lot more. Would you agree with that assertion?
Yeah, it's actually very, very true. I remember, who was it? Someone like Isabel Allende or someone who said that I know, excuse me. I know that. Hang on.
That's all right.
This is part of my stand-up act. How's it going? I rely on physical throat comedy. So she said something like, I know that I know another language when I can understand jokes and make jokes in that language. So she thought that jokes were the absolute kind of, the defining, the line. Yeah. So interestingly, yeah, I think it's very true. I would only say that it's harder with poetry, that you can get even harder than with comedy. But yeah, but I think it's a very true observation, and to think about why I'm drawn to things that are kind of so impossible for a person with my life history. Well, that may be a question for a second.
Your writing seems to me to always have one foot in the past and one in the present, both in terms of your thoughts, but also your subject matter. Would you agree?
Yeah. And I think what I said before, that I always think that you need to know the history of whatever is going on. So there are protesters on the streets of Melbourne, like understanding the history of, anything from, trade union movement, white nationalism, male violence, policing of the streets, like all of that. When I see a situation like that, my inclination, very, very strong inclination, is to start digging in order to actually understand. So I think I am one of those people who thinks that you cannot understand what's going on without understanding the history of it. And that must be reflected in the way I write. And I'm always, I'm just, for me to be in the present, just in the present as a writer, to just kind of dwell in the present is such an interesting way of writing nonfiction. And I always think that, for a really interesting piece of nonfiction, you have to be able to kind of move between the past and the present and the future. You have to kind of have that extra third leg maybe thrown into the future too, in some kind of way, whether by writing for people who are not yet born and imagining what it would be like to imagine your readers as someone who are yet to, come into the world or whatever. So I'm also really compelled by a lot of really, really interesting research that comes from, people in societies with totalitarian histories and various other histories, about the fact that, or the kind of research that challenges the idea that the past, the present, and the future are kind of distinct and separate entities, right? So that their enmeshing, I think, would be, or their fundamental enmeshing that we cannot choose to opt in and opt out of, would be probably my subject matter across all of my books, rather than just kind of moving between the past and the present. It's just the understanding that you cannot disentangle them.
So when you came to Australia, just speaking about history,
ancient history,
you would have had very little knowledge of Australian history, right? How did you go about rectifying that? Was it through reading? Was it through talking? Was it, through learning? How did and what was the evolution of your understanding of Australian history?
Well, when I went to Melbourne Uni, I would sort of pick subjects that were, I did a major in history, but I would pick this. I would almost force myself to pick this much less appealing at the time, in the very, very early 90s, Australian history subjects that were kind of not nearly as epic and as compelling as, European history or American history or, Chinese history or whatever. So I think there was that kind of path of maybe a little bit of academic study, reading, I think, but also kind of recognizing that I didn't know, and that I needed to remember at all times that I didn't know how much I didn't know. So that's really important. Like, I know it could be just a way of sort of like not doing any work, but making yourself sort of safe from criticism because you kind of embrace your ignorance or whatever. But I think it's just sort of understanding that I'm living in this place, that I'm walking on this land, and that so much of it is opaque to me, and that kind of knowledge needed to be there with me at all times, because it would push me towards learning. It would stop me from writing about things that I had no business writing about. It would get me to ask the questions that I needed to ask. So it was not quite a sort of like a solipsistic position. It was an important way, I think of being. But it took me a while, because when I came to Australia, there is a way, and I think you can still find it in Australian schools, not maybe so much at university. There is a way in which this country history is made so dull in the way that it's offered pedagogically. It's like, how can you ruin a subject? And it's like, you can learn, like you can do PhDs in how Australian history is just made to be like the worst subject you can take at school, unless you're like a true believer, come from a family that tells you things that will inspire you to want to do it, right? Indeed. So that was a bit of a battle, because at the time it felt that way at the University of Melbourne as well, that the energy was not there, that it was kind of dull and dutiful and short, because of course of the way in which all the colonial history the colonial history was paraded as the history, as opposed to as the smallest and the most violent chapter of the history of this land. So, so those barriers, I had to kind of push through them and continue to do so.
You've written a lot about place in your books. What is it that you try to capture about a place? And maybe you can talk about writing about places that you are familiar with as opposed to places you are unfamiliar with, and how does that differ?
I think place has been a way, like a way into other things as well. So a way into thinking about memory, a way into thinking about what we transmit between generations and how it gets transmitted, a way of thinking about trauma as well. Feels like a very, very powerful kind of entry point into many, many things that I am interested about, a way of thinking about the body, because there is, that very deep, enduring connection between bodies we inhabit and places we inhabit, and how the two sort of come together. I am compelled, there's a philosopher, Edward C. Casey, who is a phenomenologist, who talks about the concept of people in places. He says we can't understand what it means to just, or we can't understand what it means to be that particular person or to be ourselves without making that like people in places. That's the entanglement that, you know, that needs to be kind of respected. And I almost think that has been to some extent my way of thinking about people, that we don't know people if we don't get to understand what places, you know, bind them to each other, what places form their identities. So not to put people at the center of my writing about place, because I try not to do that now. I guess I'm much more conscious of kind of decentering the human in the way that I think about the place, not always go back to, you know, human beings. But I think for a long, long time, this was my way of thinking about, you know, human beings, myself and others, and what are the fundamental bonds that we cannot be understood away from, and place and family, I guess, would be the two that would come to mind.
Mm. What family may come into this a little bit, this next question. I'm wondering, what are the biggest challenges that you face when writing memoir pieces, whether it be a book as you've done, or whether it's just articles and pieces? I shouldn't say just. They're often harder than writing a book.
Sure.
But yeah. Yes, so let's go through the sort of the challenges in writing memoir, in terms of, you know, writing about other people and about remembering and all sorts of things. How, you know? Yeah.
So I would say that to me, writing about myself is not a problem, precisely because I'm the only one who gets to be hurt potentially in that transaction, and that's okay. It means that also I can make jokes at the expense of myself. I can make decisions where my lines are, you know, how much I want to talk about and what are the things that I don't want to talk about. And I can sort of hold fast to those decisions and to those boundaries that I set up. So that is, you know, I'm not that concerned about self-exposure. I've never felt, if I'm just exposing myself in the kind of revelations that I may want to leave on the page and, and not delete, that's okay. Like, I don't mind. I remember meeting someone at a supermarket who were looking in my supermarket trolley, and I'm like, and then they introduced themselves and they said, oh, I read your book, Otherland, which talks about, you know, myself, my daughter Billy, who was 12 at the time, and my mother, right, 3 generations of women in our family. And this person felt that they knew me through that book, and they wanted to know what was in my supermarket trolley, right? And then this person said, this absolute stranger said, how's Billy? And Billy's my daughter's name. And it took me a while, okay, you know, because I've given all this information, you know, I have revealed all sorts of things, but it never felt like a problem for me, because just of the, you know, quirks of my personality. But what is really, really difficult is writing about other people, both the living and the dead, and figuring out, you know, what I can say, what I cannot say. I'm not convinced by, you know, when people say, well, you know, it's your story, so you get to tell it. No, we are relational beings. There are always other human beings in that story. There are always other human beings who stand to be hurt by whatever it is that you reveal, right? So that has always been a very, very difficult process for me. And I have come to believe, through kind of just thinking a lot about it, that I need people to see what I write about them. So I need to see I need them to see direct quotes. If I refer to the conversations we've had or to more formal interviews, I need them to see how I describe certain passages or certain moments in their life that they have related to me or I have witnessed and observed, and that I need them to feel like they have the right to veto it. They can say, can this paragraph please go? I'm not comfortable. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. if the person says, I'm not comfortable with that particular fact about my life being in your book or in your shorter piece, I will take it out. So I've come to believe that that do not injure is, to me, is a deeper call, a deeper commandment as a writer than tell the whole truth, for instance.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting, because obviously everyone has very, I always say that everyone has a different line, and there's no right or wrong. It's just whether you. So it's interesting to know that that's your line. I'm wondering whether there's anything. What happens if somebody reads something and it involves something you've both been involved in, but their recollection is different, and you have a very different recollection. How do you navigate that? Can you think of?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the smart thing to do is to expect another person to have a different recollection, and often a radically different recollection. And the closer that person is to you, the more radically different it's likely to be. So that should be the base. You should not be surprised. Oh my God, why can't we all, all members of my family remember that particular, family event in identical terms? Expect for that to be a very, very different story. And so for me, it's what I want to be able to do in my writing is to actually represent the complexity of different people's perspectives and recollections. So rather than gunning for some kind of consensual reality, I will produce an account of what happened, and I need everyone to agree, right? Or I will, push out and erase, all the kind of dissenting views or dissenting memories. How can I make space for my memory to be written alongside the memories of others? And so that, if anything, the contradictions and complexities are amplified rather than hidden, because that's much more interesting. I mean, it reveals much more about memory, it reveals much more about what it means to be a human being, and reveals much more about families or whatever close relationships, if these people are intimates of yours, whoever, so I feel like, and when I teach nonfiction, I say to students, don't try to conceal and smooth out all the tensions and frictions and people violently disagreeing with each other. If possible, represent them on the page. This is how you will produce a better piece of writing and a deeper account of whatever it is that you're writing about.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating, and it actually segues beautifully into the next question I've got for you, which is that are your books primarily about you or about other people? Do you learn more about yourself or others through researching and writing the books?
I think it has changed. I think for some time, not everything, but many of these things, and certainly my second and third book, Courage and Otherland, were in many ways about me in relation to other people, me in relation to the big questions of my life, in relation to family, but nonetheless, I was a pretty central I was pursuing some kind of self-knowledge through research into other things. I don't think it's true, and maybe that's kind of because I'm well and truly in my middle age and I'm not interested in me that much, or I feel like I've already done that. But for whatever reason, I'm just not compelled by trying to understand myself occasionally, but not as the kind of the overarching project to try to understand myself, bigger and better. So in my fourth book, Axiomatic, I had to fight certain conventions of, the kind of, if you think about the style of that book as a certain kind of nonfiction that is pretty personal, right? There are all these pressures to position yourself as the writer in a certain way, and to be a guide to your readers, to be the eye through which your readers can see, other people and other events. And I really, really fought that. I really wanted to sideline myself. It felt like fundamentally important to my project to kind of put myself in the corner and try to get out of the way as much as possible. And that was, and I think this will continue to be my way now. And this could be just a phase, after years and years of doing the self, kind of just being over it and wanting to leave it behind, or put it to the side, not to pretend that I can ever leave it behind or write around it. It's there, and and I understand that, and I know that, but how can I make it as small as possible while it will do what it always does? The self will get in the way and will shape and color everything, and but like, how can it just not be, how can it, at the very least, how can it not be my subject matter? Like, if it has to be there and it's just going to be in the way, can I still actually write about something that is not that? Yeah.
That's really interesting what you just said, because I'm wondering, have you spoken to readers about how much of you they feel in your book? Because when and I've read Axiomatic a couple of times, and I feel you're a very large presence in it. So I'm wondering whether the reader's perception is different to your perception.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's true. But maybe what you're feeling more the voice and the energy.
Certainly.
Yeah. And I don't necessarily want to eradicate that. No. It's not like, oh, in my next project, you will feel nothing of me. It's like, that's not my goal for the next book. But I just didn't want, yes, I'm there, but hopefully I'm there maybe in slightly different ways. But I hear what you're saying. I'm sure you're right.
It feels like you're there as a sort of, it feels, actually, now that I think about it, it feels in a lot of the chapters like you're holding the hand of the person. You're holding the hand because you want them to give as much as they are willing to and can, and you're there to sort of help them along and let them know it's okay. That's how it feels. The presence to me seems very much.
You mean the people I write about?
Yes, I'm talking about the people you write about, and your presence there with them. It's their story, but it's as if you are well, more than a guide, but certainly there to help them deal with what they're talking about. Yeah. So,
but I think I'm also very conscious about all the crap that I bring to everything, right? So I think I don't.
What sort of crap? What do you mean? What
sort of crap? Oh well, where should we start, Nick? How much time have we got? No, but like so. Inspiration porn, for instance, you look at someone who is like a deeply resilient, like overwhelmingly beautiful person, and you want them to be a certain way, and their story is almost writing itself in your mind, and just to catch yourself, like, recognizing that this is what you're doing, all the ways in which you just imagine people rather than seeing them for who they are, and you imagine them in just normal interactions, right? Not just when you are writing about them or making art about them. So I think there's a lot of work, hopefully, in that book, in which I do not think of myself as a kind of just a benevolent presence, or like just a clean glass of water and you can just see through me. I'm just like, I am like this, like I don't know, that one of those ciders where they leave like bits of apples in. I'm not sort of transparent and just So I think I really appreciate what you're saying, but I think there's a lot of work in complicating my presence, even though my impulse is to hold their hand and to surround them in the deepest respect of listening and just being present to them, to whatever people tell me about, and whatever happens in their lives as we continue our relationship. But I am also recognizing and trying to keep in check and trying to make transparent or lay bare all the things that I bring into that encounter as a writer and as a human.
And just picking up again on something you just said, how hard is it to, you go into these interviews or talking to people, I guess, with preconceptions? How hard is it to either go in without preconceptions or to drop them once you're talking? Do you find it in some cases more difficult than others, or?
But I think it's more difficult. In some cases, it's more difficult than in others, particularly, if this person is very or inhabits a world that you don't know much about, and there is a tendency to try to fix them because it's so uncomfortable not to know anything. But to me, part of my creative practice is trying as much as possible to drop those expectations, drop those preconceived notions, or just be really aware that they're there. And I think what I have found that the easiest way for me to do it is through talking to people, that there is a way in which I can become, like, all of my preconceptions can be erased if I'm truly present in a conversation. I'm just listening. If it's a more mediated kind of encounter, if I am reading about them or even reading their sort of, I don't know, whatever they've written or listening to their interviews, I think I will still be held hostage to some extent by those preconceived ideas. But there is something that is just it's like you're starting from scratch in a human being. If you're truly, I really believe in the power of certain kinds of conversations. And there is a way in which I'm like, I can start a 3-hour conversation with a person I potentially may want to write about, thinking that I know quite a bit and holding on to quite a lot of ideas about that person and their life. And I can, like, truthfully end that conversation with absolute nothing, with just other than curiosity and love for them, or something. And it is possible to, through listening to them, to be undone for all of what you bring, all the what you think of as prior knowledge, to kind of be undone. Obviously, it only happens because I talk to good people, because I stay away from bad people. So my philosophy will not work if you are dealing with monsters or near monsters, or people who really offend you at some fundamental level with their philosophies or their actions. So it has been my privilege, I guess, as a writer, to focus on people that I just find good. Yeah.
So you've been writing for a long time now. In what ways do you think you're a better writer than you were earlier in your career, or maybe I should say different rather than better?
No, I think I mean I am theoretically better. Since the start of the pandemic, I have hardly written anything because I teach. I teach on Zoom. This semester 4 days a week, and I have 3 kids, and so But theoretically, I think that I probably am a better writer. One of the ways I think is that I have come to recognize that every sentence matters. I think I did, and I don't know if this is just me or other people are like that when they're starting out. I honestly thought in my 20s that as long as most of it is good, like, you can really have a little bit of just, like throat clearing or some kind of, context setting, or kind of some just low hanging fruit sort of, because, 70% of it, or the bulk of it, is what I believe to be good. And now I know that a piece of writing could be ruined by one bad sentence.
Wow.
Or one sentence that is just dead and limp on the page. That has changed. So everything counts. I will take every sentence and turn it upside down. I will look at every word. I will ask myself to justify to myself why I'm using that word. So I've become, if the kind of primary unit of writing to the younger me would be like, a page or a chapter, now it's a sentence, in a way that it wasn't before. And I think that, to me, that makes me probably, theoretically again, a better writer. I think I also trust my gut much more. So sometimes something doesn't work, it should work, but it doesn't work, and you cannot explain it, except that your whole being knows that it's just there is no vitality, there is no urgency, there is just nothing to it, and I have learned just to trust myself, just because I've been doing this for long enough to kind of go, okay, like, I don't even need to necessarily articulate to myself what's wrong. I just know it's not working, and so I can abandon things much quicker, and I'm just not flogging the dead horse for quite as long as I would in the past, or even pretend the dead horse is actually quite alive and look at her being quite perky here. So I am I'm a faster decision maker. This doesn't work. I will abandon ideas. I will abandon months and months of research. I will abandon, I'll kill my darlings right, left, and center. I'm much more decisive. I'm much more bloodthirsty, because I guess I feel like two things. A, I have no time to waste. And two, I just trust my kind of gut instinct around what's working, what's not. And conversely, something might be working, except it makes no sense. Why is it working and where am I going with it? And trusting that and staying with something that is still a little murky and hasn't quite manifested itself to you fully, but there is something in it that is worth pursuing and worth kind of giving the time to. So I've become, I guess, better at just trusting that, if something just feels like, no, just give it more time, because I've also realized that some things will not reveal themselves to you as a writer, and that would be true, I suppose, about any art form, right? If you don't give it time, right? So if you just want to, like fly in and grab it and write about and fly out, lots of things will remain hidden and unavailable to you. So sometimes it's like, okay, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but I'm just gonna hang around and just write my way around it or read my way around it and see if anything pops up.
Final question. What do you think are the ideal characteristics for a writer to have?
Sense of humor. Sense of kind of maybe skepticism around the accolades and the whole infrastructure, the literary industrial complex around you, because I think it can really drain your energy and can really take you away from doing the work if you're looking over your shoulder, if you're comparing what other writers, this writer got the grant and I didn't get the grant, or this writer got invited to the festival. I think it's very, very hard. So it's much better if you are just built that way, where you are just like, if it's rather than you have to work actively to kind of, not care. So I'm not suggesting you don't care, but you kind of like a healthy skepticism around, the fact that it's not the best books that get the biggest gongs, and it's just things that, work with the market in a particular way and are, lucky enough to be pushed by, sufficiently big apparatus behind them or whatever that might be. I think that's really, really important, because what is really terrible for a writer, I think, or the kind of writer that I always aspired to be, is jealousy and envy and a sense of, resentment. So if you are living in that place of resentment because others are doing better, I think that's really, really a crap place to be. And especially now with all the resources, all the kind of non-existent resources being drained, it's such a tough space to inhabit. So just not to look at your peers and not to compare and contrast, I think is really, really important. I think not being too ambitious, in other words, or reorienting your ambition. So if your ambition is not, to achieve the highest visibility, but your ambition is to do the best work that you can in this moment in your life, I think that kind of reorientation also just produces better work. So I think to me, these questions are never about technique. I think they're always kind of philosophical questions about the self of the writer. Obviously, talent helps. Vision helps, but ultimately I just always think, like Zadie Smith talked about, that direct line between the writer and their sort of inner self, and it's like they're not two separate things that are somehow a little bit related. They're just like so related. And to me, it's about remembering that turning yourself to the work more than to the world that will, even if the world will applaud for 2 minutes and then the world will move on. And if that's all you have, you won't be able to live off it. You just will need more and more and more, and you won't get it. Too many writers out there. So if your orientation is towards the work, and if you are energized by and just exhilarated by something that can happen at the level of a sentence. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember someone. Where was it? There was like a conversation when a writer was asked by a student, should I be a writer? And that writer, who I really love, I can't remember who it is, said, do you like sentences? You know, like you really need to like sentences. You really need to like language. You really need to kind of feel that if at the end of 8 hours at your desk, you got one paragraph that sings and dances, that's a good day. You know, so another thing is reorienting your ideas of productivity, because I think we're all infected by certain ideas of what productivity looks like. And I think that can really push people to write much faster than they should be writing, research much faster. And then you produce, you know, book-shaped objects, not actual books. They don't last, because if you haven't put in that work of writing and research and thinking, you know, especially in the world of nonfiction, with some exceptions, those works just disappear really quickly. So not be infected by the whole, you know, sort of idea of what it means to be, you know, a productive writer who's got 12 projects on the go, and just be a bit, just being a bit more skeptical about it, I think is a good thing. Sorry, that is a very sprawling
It's a brilliant response, and it should be of no surprise to me that your response was a philosophical one rather than a technique.
Yeah. I don't believe that technical, you know, it's like, you know, as a teacher of writing as well, you know, Nick, I don't know if you do this, but I'm always like, when I mark students, I'm always like, surprise me. Show me that everything I know about writing is false. Show me that all the things I hold dear actually, you know, like break every rule that I hold dear and produce an original work, and like give it to me, as opposed to, you know, going into that space and, you know, sort of looking for my convictions to be affirmed, right? So technique can be anything, and you can break every rule, you can write a whole thing that is just, you know, telling and not showing, not showing a single thing, you know. Or whatever, and you can produce brilliant work. And I've seen that. So to me, the fundamental things are the philosophical things rather than the technical things.
Thank you, Marie. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure, Nick. Thank you for your fantastic questions.